we have officially made it through another holiday season. The shopping and meals, the parties and family gatherings, all the expectations piled high on top of decades worth of memories. There are some wonderful traditions and joy to be found, but holidays are never simple. I want to add one more to the list of holidays that is a bit complicated. It's tomorrow, the day that we celebrate the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We tend to remember him as a preacher who ushered in integration through nonviolence, a man who was tragically killed. All of that is true. What is also true is that Dr. King was a radical. It wasn't just Klan members who disagreed with him. Over the course of his life, King was not loved or even liked by most. By the time he died, he was an incredibly maligned figure. The FBI called him the most dangerous man in America at one point and had a 17,000-page file on him by the time he died. My own uncle recently shared the disturbing story of how his Methodist pastor celebrated the assassination. He basically said, "It should have happened sooner," but in language that I would never repeat from the pulpit. It wasn't just King's insistence on nonviolence and integration that bothered people, though. His linkages between American racism, poverty, and the Vietnam War pushed the envelope too far. Though it's not the main thrust of today's sermon, I have to say Dr. King would be appalled at the tens of billions of dollars the U.S. is sending to Israel to displace, starve, and virtually annihilate Palestinian people in Gaza. But I guarantee you, tomorrow, Joe Biden and nearly every other elected official will praise Dr. King for a watered-down version of his legacy. Ignoring his true commitment is a way of muzzling a movement that continues to this day. Another part of taking power out of the civil rights movement is pinning everything on one man. Dr. King was incredibly smart and a gifted preacher, but more and more I learn about a whole cadre of brilliant strategists who guided him along the way. I'm kind of reminded of the Unitarian theologian Theodore Parker's sermon, The Transient and the Permanent in Christianity. In 1841, in this sermon, he kind of set the course for Unitarian Universalism. He argued that the true core of our faith is love. All of the institutions of church and all of the scripture and even the person of Jesus himself point to this true core of a loving God. And that love is so elemental, so true, that it would remain even if those other transient things had never existed. Even without the person of Jesus himself, the truth of the message would still remain. And this is an odd way to celebrate Dr. King, but I believe that the civil rights movement and the steady march toward freedom for all people is true and so necessary that it would have happened even without Dr. King. It would have looked different, and it may have taken longer, but it would have happened even without him. Today, I want to celebrate a broad network of courageous people who worked alongside him and before him and after him. One of the inspirations for this sermon was a children's book called Choosing Brave, How Mamie Till Mobley and Emmett Till Sparked the Civil Rights Movement. Most of us know the basics of this story. At 14 years old, Emmett Till was mutilated, shot, and dumped in the river in Mississippi for being accused of flirting with a white woman. For too long, I knew this story as something that had happened to someone, and it ended there. There's a different way of holding that story, though. It's a story of courage and resistance, mostly about Emmett's mother, Mamie. Mamie Carthen was a child of the Great Migration up from Mississippi. As a child, her family settled outside of Chicago. She was grateful to be out of the South and studied hard. She was the first African American to graduate top of her class in that high school. Mamie began spending time with an amateur boxer, Lewis Till. Not long after they started seeing each other, he took her out for ice cream. She hadn't realized that he intended to sit in the middle of a restaurant surrounded by white people. The owner was furious about what they were doing, but she stayed put and did the brave thing. She got married to Lewis, and just shy of 19 years old, became pregnant with Emmett Till. It was a very difficult birth in 1941. Doctors said there was little hope that Emmett would ever walk or talk or learn much of anything, so they suggested he be put in an institution, but Mamie said no, she chose otherwise, and she brought him home. It turned out that Emmett's dad, Lewis, was a boxer through and through, and I guess the nicest thing you could say would be that he took his work home with him. Eventually, he left for the Army, and she changed the locks. Despite all the doctor's warnings, Emmett actually grew and he thrived. He worked odd jobs to earn extra money, but still, as he was a child, Emmett contracted polio, like many children did then. After a struggle, he recovered physically, but was left with a stutter from that polio. Mamie coached him through speech challenges, and when he felt tied up, she told him to stop, take a breath, and whistle. Whistling calmed Emmett Till so that he could gather his words from his stutter. One day, Emmett got an invitation from family to travel south to visit them in Mississippi. As an only child in the Chicago area, he longed for this open space and this extended group of cousins to spend time with. At first, she said, no way. But eventually, she relented. Emmett was a smart and good-mannered boy. Maybe he would be safe. A week and a day after he boarded the train for Mississippi, she received the fateful phone call. Fishermen had found his body in the Tallahatchie River, bruised, scarred, and swollen. The stories of the murder were varied. What is very clear was that it started with a whistle. The sheriff wanted to bury Emmett in Mississippi that day to make things quick. But Mamie said no. The land that killed him would not keep him. Instead, she spent more than a year's wages to bring his body home. The casket arrived in a box with a lock that had no key and legal papers forbidding anyone from opening it. Mamie had other plans. She would see her son, and soon so would the world. For 4 long days, she let other people come and bear witness to mourn her son. Over 10,000 people attended the funeral and the viewing. Reporters, of course, came to document what had happened to a 14-year-old boy. And those images, that story published across the country, was the match that ignited the civil rights movement in a whole different way. Mamie traveled back to Mississippi to attend the murder trial amidst jeers and threats. After an hour of deliberation, the all-white jury came with the verdict, not guilty. After that, she toured with the NAACP all over the country, having rallies, calling for justice, not just for Emmett, but for other young people. She eventually returned to school to become a teacher. She poured her life into teaching young people and built up a team of young performers who were skilled at reciting the speeches of Dr. King. She called them the Emmett Till Players. The courage of Mamie Till Mobley is jaw-dropping. She died almost exactly 20 years ago, January 6th, 2003. Thousands came to celebrate her achievements. One of the people who was watching the coverage of Emmett Till was Franklin McCain, who was the exact same age as Emmett. 4 years later, McCain headed to college in Greensboro, North Carolina. He studied there with his three friends, Jim Briel Kazan, David Richmond, and Joseph McNeil, on a regular basis. And their study sessions, as happens in college, often turned to deeper, heavier discussions. Jim Crow still ruled in the South, and this group of friends figured the more they just talked about the problems, the more they were part of them. So instead of talking, they decided to take action. Now, sit-ins had been tried here and there before, but they weren't terribly effective. But these 4 college freshmen decided to give it a try anyway in their hometown. Without prompting from adults or guidance from the movement, the 4 of them sat at a counter together at the white section at Woolworth's. The next day, they returned with a dozen other students. 5 days later, numbers grew to 1,000 students marching down the streets of Greensboro. A few weeks later, students in Nashville decided to duplicate the efforts, and sit-ins quickly grew to 50 cities across the South. Franklin McCain often spoke about his experience with young people. In one of those moments, he told students, "Never ask permission to start a revolution." I think that's brilliant advice. Never ask permission to start a revolution. That same year, Diane Nash, one of the movement's most formidable organizers, took her leadership role as the spin-off sit-ins happened starting in Nashville. She was among the most outspoken and effective advocates of the civil rights movement, and again, we don't hear as much about her. Nash spent a year at Howard University before she transferred to Fisk University in Nashville. She saw the impact that was happening in Greensboro, and she realized the potential for these sit-ins, so she pushed them wider and wider. That same year, 1960, was the first big march of the civil rights movement. This is still pretty early in the movement. It was spontaneous, but she had the wit to harness that power in an incredible way. That year, the home of a Nashville civil rights attorney, Z. Alexander Luby, was bombed, and the black community and supporters were stirred into action. Spontaneously, they began to march in the city's streets, and as the marchers approached the steps of City Hall, Nashville's mayor, Ben West, stepped out to greet them. With television cameras rolling, Diane Nash directly asked, "Mayor West, do you feel that it's wrong to discriminate against a person solely on the basis of their race or color?" At that moment, on camera, Mayor West admitted that he believed segregation was morally wrong. And Nashville began desegregating its public facilities 3 weeks later. That was 4 years before Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Part of her success stemmed from her refusal to compromise. They refused to pay bail when they were arrested or put in jail. At one point, she faced a 2-year sentence for, I love this, encouraging the delinquency of minors for training them in nonviolent protest. She was 5 months pregnant at the time. At the trial, for refusing to sit at the back of the courtroom, the judge had sentenced her to 10 days for contempt of court. Nash later said that attempt to intimidate her with 10 days had the exact opposite effect. In jail for those days, she realized that she could live with virtually nothing. Fortunately, the judge dropped the 2-year sentence, probably to avoid attracting criticism for jailing a pregnant woman. But this is the best part. Upon her release, Diane Nash wrote a personal letter to the judge, sharing her address in case he wanted to put her back in jail. She was also a central figure organizing the Freedom Rides. And after all of her leadership, she was hesitant to be portrayed as a solitary leader in the movement. In a 2011 documentary, Diane Nash said, in a democracy, the citizens are rulers of the country. And today, I don't think that most Americans feel like we are rulers, and therefore we don't act like it. We should begin doing that. If you're not going to take responsibility, you as an individual, then who is? She says. There's one more person I want to talk about. It's the person who we saw in the video earlier. Until recently, Bayard Rustin was arguably the most overlooked leader of the civil rights movement. There's a new movie on Netflix called Rustin. It focuses on his work organizing the 1963 March on Washington. Yes, he was the organizer of the March on Washington. There were countless other people involved, but Bayard Rustin is credited with being the central figure that pulled off that ground-shaking event. The video that we saw earlier was interspersed with scenes from the movie with the actual people. I selected it because it shows Rustin's ability to identify and inspire young leaders and to bring a team together. He empowered young activists with huge amounts of trust and responsibility. For him, it was so clearly about building a team, a movement, something that no one person could have accomplished alone. Now, creating justice is through and through with his storyline. I am not going to talk about all of his adventures, but they are rich and amazing and long, starting all the way from high school, insisting that a road trip with classmates that black students be housed in the same hotel as white students. He spent 2 years, 28 months in federal prison after being arrested as a conscientious objector. His writings about that experience changed prison systems. He traveled to India to learn from Gandhi and the Free India movement. He was among the first freedom writers. After that, he spent 30 days of hard labor on a chain gang after being arrested. The man never stopped. He traveled to Ghana and Nigeria and South Africa to teach them about nonviolence and their liberation movements. But his most notable contributions were around the March on Washington. Ahead of the march, the planning committee had nominated Diane Nash, who we heard about, to speak at the gathering. Ultimately, however, no women were allowed to address the crowd, as only official leaders were allowed to speak. And as I said, Bayard Rustin is overlooked as a historical figure, Part of that is probably due to his early, very left political leanings, including Communist Party alignment and being a gay man in those days, as a pretty open secret made him a little bit of an embarrassment to the civil rights movement. He never wanted his sexual orientation to distract from the movement, and so was happy to take a behind-the-scenes role. What mattered to him most was getting the job done, not getting credit for the job. So the civil rights movement wasn't just about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or just about Emmett or Mamie Till. It wasn't just about Diane Nash or Bayard Rustin. It was a groundswell of people taking brave action, making big sacrifices to change their corner of the world. So let us celebrate a legacy. Not by closing a chapter of history or narrowing the focus to one individual. Let us celebrate with a broad vision of hope, with gratitude for countless people, known and unknown, who helped shape our world. And remember that there is still plenty of place for us in that work today. Amen.